the Prime Minister to the floor.
Hi, can I be heard? Okay, yeah. I just switched my audio input. Am I still audible? Is the audio quality all right? Okay. Okay, yeah. I prefer POIs in the chat, and I'll be taking POIs at around 5 minutes, preferably from closing. Yeah, beginning in a bit. Beginning in 3, 2, 1. Let's get right into this debate. What is the model in which we support? We support like literally the status quo. We support things like, for example, the A levels, or for example, the GCSE exams for leaving secondary school, right? And we also support things like, for example, in-school testing. But the model in which we support is, for example, having schools holding 1 to 2 major exams every year, as opposed to having, for example, 20 learning checkpoints and like 30 graded assignments throughout the year. That is the model which we support, right? What will continuous assessments look like on site opposition? It will look like, for example, small tests, basically like tests at the end of every chapter, little quizzes that contribute to the overall grade. Things like, for example, soft skills like group presentation, things like, grading homework into the final grade, or it looks like, for example, research projects and like group projects, etc. It also looks like, for example, taking into account extracurricular like achievements into, for example, the overall achievement of students when it comes to like calculating their university admission score. What is the goal in this debate? We're going to prove 2 things. Firstly, we're going to prove that, for example, having one like high stakes exam like minimizes factors that do not relate to the academic ability and the otherwise deservedness of the student. And secondly, we'll explain how this like makes the exams fairer and how it better benefit minorities. Notice that the clarification here is that wealth and social economic status will affect uni admissions on both sides to a certain extent anyways. It's just how we make it fairer and minimize the influence of wealth and social economic status. Moving on to my first argument of explaining why we make it fairer for minorities by hosting high stakes exams. Now, there are a few reasons. Firstly, the first reason is that it's just easier for us to, it's easier for minorities who are often systematically disadvantaged, for example, financially and socially, to do better at one exam as opposed to like multiple long-term exams, right? This is for a variety of reasons, right? 3 reasons under this tier. Firstly, like underprivileged students often have to engage in things like, for example, part-time jobs in order to, for example, supplement their family income, right? And therefore, the model in which, for example, the high stakes exam works is that, for example, let's say you have 5 years of secondary school education, the crunch year really occurs in, for example, the 5th year, right? Where it's possible for you to, for example, like relearn everything that has been taught in the 1st to 4th years, and then you like have the crunch year where you revise everything in the 5th year and sit for the A-level exams, right? Now, within the comparative here, is that disadvantaged students cannot afford to, for example, forego all 5 years of like part-time job income if they have continuous assessments throughout all 5 years, right? They'll be under all 5 years, they'll be under continuous stress to both hold down a part-time job and also do, for example, all the continuous assessments in school. The comparative is that they only have to, for example, forego part-time income in, like, for example, the last year, and therefore allow them to have like better academic performance. But secondly, poor schools often have less resources, so they often focus on graduating students as opposed to, for example, younger students, right? So, for example, if you have like the best teachers are often going to be pulled to the year of students which are going to be sitting their school leaving exams, and therefore like younger students will be neglected. Therefore, this will contribute to an overall poorer like extended academic performance by minorities. But thirdly, recognize for the types of continuous assessment, it is much harder for minorities to self-learn, right? Things like, for example, research projects, things like, for example, group presentations that require soft skills. They are not easy to learn by just reading a book, right? You require skilled staff to be able to teach you such skills, right? But oftentimes, like such staff and like such skills are in short supply in underprivileged schools, right? It's not, but in contrast, it's much easier, for example, for you to read a textbook and like self-learn, because like all the things you need to know are in the textbook, and your quality of education does not like rely on having someone else teaching you. Secondly, recognize that a lot of long-term assessments systematically benefit wealthier students, right? Long-term assessments like research projects or group work like benefit wealthier students who are, for example, able to access tutoring or able to buy more like well-researched like research academic papers to back up their research work in the first place. Things that underprivileged students often do not have, right? Things like, for example, extracurricular endeavors, which like poorer students often do not have the time or do not have the resources to access, necessarily disadvantaged like minority students when it comes to university admissions. These are the many reasons why, for example, this will disproportionately disadvantage minorities when it comes to university admissions. The comparative is that all of these benefits are all of these harms are confined to the year in which these minority students are taking their final high stakes exam. You no longer have to, for example, stress over all 5 years of your education. The stress is confined to 1 year. It makes it much easier for them to do better. Now, secondly, we explained to you why, for example, a single high stakes exam is a better measure of performance. 3 reasons. Firstly, it is more reflective of the outside world. In the outside world, there's no consistent stress. Most of the time, if you work in a law firm, for example, there are periods of rest and periods of high stakes crunch time where there are lots of clients and lots of paperwork. I think this is more reflective of students' ability to adapt to the real life situation. Secondly, consistent testing actually leads to poorer testing. This is because, for example, when you segment a paper, for example, if I test by chapters, it's much easier to test because I know that this math paper that's testing is specifically testing me on binomial expansions. Whereas in reality, when you're given a math question, you're not going to know what idea is specifically being tested. When you are tested holistically in a national high stakes exam, you are actually better able to see how things connect across chapters. We think segmenting chapters is not very academically viable. But moving on to my third argument is to explain why it is easier to cheat on, for example, long-term assessments, right? 2 reasons. Firstly, because of so many assessments throughout the year for so many students for all the years, it's much harder for you to achieve national levels of anti-cheating precautions as compared to if you held tests throughout the year, right? It's much easier for you to properly invigilate and secure one exam for one batch of students as opposed to securing 20 exams for all batches of students. But before I move on, I'll take a PR in closing.
You can't just give up a part-time job for 3 months to do your exams. If you have consistent work for 5 years, you can manage your job around that. Why is that not preferable?
Look, we think that, for example, even if that mechanism falls, the rest of the mechanisms still stand, right? Because recognize that, for example, the fact that first of all, you're probably going to place a lot of stress on students to, for example, be assuming that the level of academic rigor stays the same, students will still have to take out large proportions of their time to deal from their part-time job to deal with academics anyways. But that's besides the point, right? The point here is that the point at which you, for example, allow continuous assessments, you're going to have lower levels of anti-cheating precautions. But secondly, the reality is that oftentimes these in-school assessments are going to be graded by their own schools in the first place, which makes it even more unfair by virtue of the fact that some schools may skew the grades of their students to, for example, boost their university admission statistics to attract more students. And realistically, wealthier schools are better able to get away with this because they, for example, have the money and connections to bribe off officials to stay under the radar. Right? We think overall we are able to, for example, significantly benefit the minority group, which is most important given that university is an important avenue for social mobility we're incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that member for what was a very fine speech. I'd now like to welcome the Leader of Opposition to carry on the debate. Hear. That member for what was a very fine speech. And I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue side opening government's case. Hear.
Hi, sorry, can I be seen and heard now? Okay, yeah, sorry. The same thing happened as it did yesterday, the connection dropped out, but I can be heard, right? So that's all good. Great stuff. I'll start in a couple of seconds. I want to discuss 2 things. Firstly, what is fair, and secondly, what makes schools better. Firstly, what is fair? And notice that Tash has this incredibly important argument still standing in this round about underprivileged communities, not just minorities, but underprivileged individuals as well. I'm going to push this mechanism further by giving two further observations about poorly resourced schools. First thing to note is that often poorly resourced schools are seen as categorically weaker, and therefore their continuous exams are being ignored as that of a lower quality. This will happen, for example, in the recent A-level situation where there was no A-levels due to COVID, and often this results from state schools and more poor schools were being systematically undermined. Or cannot assume to us, without they have no fear in this round, to assume to us that everyone can afford the IB in this debate or afford standardized exams that are monitored to an incredibly high and rigorous national standard. But even if they can, it is still tempered by the expectations of weaker schools producing weaker students. Only a single national grade can overturn that mindset. But secondly, as Passion tells you, you can only concentrate good resources for final year students in schools with less resources. Therefore, the comparative is that on our side, in more poorer schools where there's less resources to give for every single student, also we can focus them on the last year students and give them a better shot at doing well in the national exam. To this, we hear two responses from opening opposition and closing opposition. The first is that, well, you should just manage your job better in the 6 years, right? No, come on, this is a reality check. The difference is we don't want people to have to balance a job for 6 years while studying in school to go to university. That's the comparative that we're dealing with here. So we think that that's actually completely out of the round. We want people to not be studying do not be working at all while they're studying. But secondly, O tells us that the tutors actually give you a bigger edge without any analysis whatsoever. Two responses. Firstly, if you mention in the next line that there are more skills needed, then you can be tutored in those more skills, right? So it's actually better on our side when you have less stuff that you can be tutored in, never have a skill advantage or money advantage in. Stuff like public speaking or presentations on their side can be tutored in as well. But secondly, if their stuff is continuous or take home, like the IB literally is, then there's even more meta and skill for tutor intervention and better resource schools to give you an edge as well. But secondly and crucially, what actually is a fair university admission? We think OO almost gets that when they tell us about how uni is not strictly about hard work, but rather about whether you're able to survive in a uni course and survive in the outside world as well. Therefore, we think that the high stake test actually better represents that. Two reasons why. Because firstly, as Hashan tells you, it's about knowledge application over a long period of time. It's about the 3-year curriculum of the A-levels being coalesced and having seen holistic interdependencies between the topics, not just studying for a micro topic at one go. But secondly, it's about calmness in high stake situations as well. Because in life, you'll be in many high-stake situations, like novice finals or a job interview or novice finals again, right? So clearly, we make people more prepared for these high-stake situations that they have to engage in anyway. So the comparative is that if they do these sort of things anyway, we make them better prepared for that. But secondly, even if we buy that, let's just do with their best course on consistency as well. The first thing is that often provisions can be made for genuine extenuating circumstances in exams. That is to say that if you fell sick, you broke up, your dad died, for example, I'm really sorry about that, right? Like it's easier to make provisions for this one exam than to do it over a continuous period of time. But secondly, why is consistency important? Why can't we reward late bloomers, those who click in the final year of school, those who grind really, really hard in their last year and get the good grades required? In fact, I will suggest to you that these late bloomers are the best people to do well at university because they are the ones who prove at the point of admission that they are the people who have a good body of work and able to put together everything at the last moment and do well in university. Those who are more consistent, for example, may have a lower level of threshold throughout. Therefore, this weighing is about what you choose in this round. Why do you think that minorities and late bloomers matter more? Minorities matter more because there are people who are systematically failed by the education system. They're often trapped due to the lack of education and therefore need relief from a fairer education system that recognizes the disadvantage that they have to cope with. But secondly, we care about late bloomers as well because we want to reward effort and hard work. Many people often do the lack of proper schooling, the lack of preschool, for example, lack of change of mindset, for example, often get the act together in the last years of school. And we think we want to reward these people who are able to do so at last. We don't think why on their side, why can they say these people should be ignored? But secondly, let's take the overall metric in this round as well. How does this change teaching in schools? We think that we thank OO for saying basically what we want to say, like impacting for us that high stakes is not a really good thing. We think that we want to create a better environment for schools. But crucially, let's just do a couple of things to help OO on this. Firstly, why do you think this actually creates tangible changes in schools? There are two mechanizations for this. The first is that often teachers react to external incentives like this. The reality is that they don't want to overwork or prepare excessively for assignments if they're not necessary. And secondly, obviously, children also scale their level of effort based on how much they have to study. Therefore, how do you take up O on their best course another metric of making a less pressure environment for students in schools? I have 5 responses. Firstly, on their side, they repeat this over and over again for every single continuous examination. Because the problem is that the symmetry in this debate is caring about every exam for university admissions. On their side, you care about the first exam to the last because it will affect their grade point average. Secondly, because schools react as well, there's pressure to create even more mini quizzes and prep quizzes to prepare for the bi-monthly or the bi-termly exam, right? Thirdly, because comparatively, we can have all of your good stuff like holistic assessments or learning journeys without the threat of having it being factored into grades. Fourthly, because on their side, they place students into existential panic. If your course is 3 years, for example, they spend the last 2 years worrying about failing that one course that they did in the first year. But lastly, because what is symmetric is that people stress. But the trade-off is that even if you said that there's some degree of stress on outside, it's even worse. The trade-off is that the work is about single, one-off, high-stakes stresses. And that's what we have to prepare students for on our side of the house. So even if you have to accept that there is some degree of high stakes, we think we do it far better. We don't see why their side is proven problematic in this round. Before I proceed forward, I'm going to take a POI from closing opposition.
Why are high stakes exams the only things that can prepare you for high stakes situations? Why can't you like play football or do debating?
I mean, you can, but many people don't play football and many people don't do debating. This is why we are doing this right now, right, on a Sunday. So clearly for those who can do so in other places, that's fine. But actually, that's even better for our side because we actually give people the preparation in schools for those other high-stake things that they do in the future. So if I buy your logic that there is many high-stake events in the student's life, then it's even better for them to encounter them in schools. It minimizes the harms of them doing so in schools as well. I don't see the point of your point of information. Why is the argument so impactful? Because on our side, we people hate school deaths. They don't hate the fact that now have weekly quizzes every part of term to prepare them for the quiz at the end of term. But when they're better prepared for the future as well, the future of high-stake stresses and the future of being examined on a one-off basis where people don't really respect your body of work. It doesn't matter if you get 15 points out of 15 if you lose in the octo finals. I'm really sorry for that one more time. Therefore, weighing these ideas up, right, why is this more important? Because even if we accept that we lose the debate on uni admissions, we are still able to prove through this independent benefit that we prepare students more better for the outside world on a unique basis. And crucially, even if we can't do that, at least to make schools a safer place for students by making them less stressed and less worried having to test daily on a daily basis. We think that on the metric of preparing students well, we did far better on opposition. We win both the government op metrics. We're very proud to stand in open government.
I'd like to thank that member for his very fine speech. I'd now like to welcome the DLO to conclude the top half of the debate. Here.
Hi, just checking that I am audible and visible.
Yep.
Great, thank you. Okay, just setting up my timer. If I could have POIs in the chat, that would be great. And if I don't get to you for a while, feel free to turn on your camera and just wave at me. That works as well. Alrighty. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think there are 3 main things that we need to be having a look at, because I think these are the key metrics for like why we actually need admissions tests and why universities are like looking for the top quality students, right? I think firstly, we need to look at things like what gives you the best indication of a student's ability. Secondly, having a look at what actually gives you a better learning process. And thirdly, what gives you better education standards overall. So firstly, addressing what gives you a better indication of students' abilities. What does OG tell us? They tell us that they get a more holistic test, right? Because everything is like put together in the finals and covered in your final exams. First response here is that it's actually always going to be more restricted, right? Because you're going to have less number of questions per topic, per subject in any like final exam. For instance, like 1/10 of your overall final maths exam is going to cover calculus. This leaves like a very small number of questions on calculus overall. Whereas when you have consistent tests or exams or like assessment tasks throughout the year, you actually get to cover topics in subjects more holistically. Second response here is that when you test everything in the same way, you don't actually get to explore the ways that students are able to respond to different situations. For instance, in English, you just have one essay or like multiple choice questions for science. Instead, what you get in our world is like, say, English is now tested as an essay, as an oral presentation, as multiple reflections throughout the year. We think, therefore, you actually get more holistic indications of like what a student's ability actually is. Secondly, we say that to test like abilities, right, you need consistent invigilation. This doesn't just mean like having one end of year test or exam like OG is trying to tell you. We think what this actually looks like is having cross-marking occur. What it looks like is having anonymous marking. It looks like, say, schools needing to mark tests of students in different schools in an anonymous anonymous way. We think it looks like this cross-marking where like maybe 2 or 3 teachers need to mark these like exams or like oral presentations. We think, again, this gives you better invigilation on our side because it's not only more consistent and it happens throughout the year, but it also means that you reduce the like amount of bias you get. Why do you get bias on an OG side? Is because many advantage schools are going to have like past staff and teachers work as chief examiners, or you're going to have chief examiners who now join these advantage schools because they are paid for this work and they get to teach students exactly how to answer these final exams, how to prepare for these final exams, and the types of questions that will occur time and time again. So secondly, having a look at why we actually get a better learning process on our side, right? Firstly, like I think my leader already told you a lot about mental health and how like here you're always going to like have it better because you don't have this massive like high stakes thing looming like at the end of your degree. But in terms of like the existential panic that OG tells you about, we think that like a whole part of education is learning to like work with this, learning to cope and learning to like have better mechanisms to deal with stress. We think it's so much better when you don't just wait for the one moment of impending doom where you have to like wait and have all that stress built up, but rather learn to work through it better each time. It means after your like 5th assessment task, you have now learned what like learning structure works best for you, the best way that you can address stress. Maybe it's like going for a walk beforehand. Maybe it's talking to friends and family. I think being able to have multiple assessment tasks means that you get to practice this, means that you get to see what works best for you, and means that you actually get to benefit your mental health here. You do not have existential panic because you are in a learning process. We think that you're also able to learn from the different like mechanisms that your friends use to like help themselves like reduce stress. We think also being able to get used to what an exam like environment looks like reduces stress. Like purely like we see this happen all the time. That's why we have like practice exams, because our teachers tell us you get to practice what these conditions look like so that you're less stressed and less like confused and disoriented in the actual exam. Second thing here is also that like we reduce things like cramming. Like I think my leader already told you about this, but also like it's the actual mechanism of OG is that cramming is good, right? They're saying like we allow disadvantaged students to cram. I don't think this is a long-term solution. I don't think this is a good thing that we should be supporting. I don't think that for all the mental health like things I already told you about, especially for people who like already experience like other situations at home, who experience things like ADHD and have like a lot of difficulty sitting in a long like 3 or 4 hour final exam, we already think like all these things add together to have like even worse outcomes for people who are disadvantaged. Thirdly, we think it's just easier to approach the year knowing that you have multiple opportunities to prove yourself, as opposed to like waiting till the end and like knowing that all this content is building up, you have to memorize everything for the end. We think it's much more approachable when you take things system by system or topic by topic. We think this also means you probably get gradual interest in the things you're learning. We think that students are probably going to gain that interest over time and get to like think about which topics like they enjoyed the most, because they can take it step by step. It encourages things that are a reflection of your work. It encourages things like extended science projects because you can now mark it at different steps. And then finally, we also think like in terms of this better learning process, we actually get better preparation for real life. When they tell you things like, you know, you get finals exams just like, you know, a final debating round, we think actually that's not actually what happens, right? We have all these rounds leading up to the finals. All of these rounds are like rounds where you are marked, you get feedback and you get marking along the way. This is actually what gets you like progress in education. This is what gets you better learning. This allows you to improve. We think it means you get feedback and you get to understand how you went on your previous round and how you went in previous steps in life, such that you can improve here. And it also means that you probably like get just regular updates on how you're going. We think this is a good way to track your education and therefore be more incentivized to learn. I'll take something from closing. No, opening.
Why should late bloomers be unfairly disadvantaged?
Sure. Well, I think, okay, if you want to talk about late bloomers, we have to think about, firstly, the number of people who are late bloomers. We need to weigh this against like the majority of people who learn incrementally, who like cannot cram, the majority of people who cannot like, you know, just suddenly like, you know, memorize things really, really quickly in the final like month. We think that the majority of people are just not going to benefit on your side. And even then, we think late bloomers are probably still going to be able to do this anyway, because if you're a late bloomer and like just under the status quo, you just generally, you know, are able to memorize suddenly so much better, or like at the end, towards the end of your degree, you're able to do that so much better than anyone else, you probably skew your results anyway because of like how outliers work, right? That's like why we take an average, right? It probably also gives you an indication of like how well someone is able to pick up new tasks and that sort of thing. We think universities will want to know this. And very finally, how we actually get better education standards overall. We see firstly, like in terms of fairness for minorities, OG tells us that, you know, that they need more time to like work full time because and they can't access things like tutoring. First response here is that like tutors like tutors teach very specific things, such as methods to like approach your finals. We think while you can do this over time, the more time that an advantaged student has to prepare and get tutoring and get access to past papers, the better they do and the wider the disparity is. What you get on OG is advantaged students now have a full year to use this tutoring, a full year to access these past papers and practice very specifically for an exam, as opposed to on our side where you can practice for an oral and then you need to practice for something else. It probably takes more intuition. It probably like is able to better standardize what you're taught. And then very finally, for like overall less advantaged students, we think that to the extent that like your accessibility to these things is pretty symmetric on both sides, we'd much rather you have the opportunity to use your own personal skills and creativity in this learning. Very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that member for what was a very fine speech. I'd now like to welcome the member of government to begin the bottom half of the debate. Here.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, let me just get my timer up. So please, POIs in the chat. I'll take a POI hopefully around 5 minutes, preferably from opening. Okay, get my timer up. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. What you get from OO and OG is very confusing because both of them just basically don't really weigh upon each other, because OO tells you we're going to motivate students in the long term. We're going to give them this beautiful, like brilliant, varied education that's extremely balanced and has all these different skills that you're going to learn about. OG tells you that you're going to have disadvantage to late bloomers. You get more motivation and real world skills. I think I think it's very difficult to adjudicate who wins. And I think the problem is that both teams struggle with impacting, because on either side, there's a fixed number of uni places. You're not going to get more students at university, right? So, and I think there's a problem with OG. It hasn't been brought up yet, but I'm worried that CO is going to run it. And so we're going to run a mech that's independent of the rebuttal, that's potentially going to be run by CO, which is that contextual admissions exist. And that's the problem, because contextual offers already ensure that a certain portion of universities go to minorities, go to disadvantaged students who have to perform less well on standardized examination to get in. So it's not clear then how you're going to get more minorities into university. Through this metric, through having this sort of metric and model given by OG and OO. We're going to give you a way of how you're actually going to prove real world educational standards, not just in terms of exam scores, but actual education that's on the ground. We're going to give you mechanisms for how you incentivize this and allow students to actually learn. And from this, we're going to be able to cash out the fact that students are going to be able to be not just get skills that education generally give, but are more likely as minorities not to require contextual requirements. And so we're actually logically prior to all these teams, because we're able to prove underneath, we're able to prove how we actually get much better educational outcomes. And this is the thing that you ought to care in this debate, and why a greater proportion above and beyond what might be given by context is given to minorities, and we're actually able to ensure their success at university. Okay, so why are we going to get better education? We get a really unclear model from OO, so I'm just going to give you what I think is probably their best case model, right? I think that they give this comparison about IB in my POI. I think IB still has a massive standardized exam component to it, so I don't think this is their model. I think the model needs to be something that takes an average performance. I think it's at best something that each school decides upon independently. They decide to do certain quizzes, presentation, coursework. Teachers will decide probably most of these elements. Maybe you have some anonymity, you have some collaboration with other schools, but this is all relatively small scale. The idea is that schools decide these syllabuses, right? You have some maybe vague government oversight. I think this is the best case from OO, and this is basically what OO runs. Just I'm trying to summarize it so that we can be comparative. Okay, so what's going to happen here is, I think firstly I'm going to win on OG's metric, which is that poor students are going to have much greater access and are much more likely to do well on standardized exams. It's not because they're more able to read a textbook. It's because of resources. If you have a standardized exam, it's extremely clear what is going to be taken in the exam, because you're reliant on like you're reliant on teachers communicating this to you, and you have to deal with all the idiosyncrasies of your school. So you're reliant on like your school being communicative to you. Chances are, like, if you go to a bad school, your school is not going to communicate this very well to you. Like, teachers are like less likely to do this. But I'm going to say that you're going to get much more support because we live in the internet age. And so if there's a single standardized exam that everyone has to do, it's very clear what you need to do. There's a very clear like national syllabus and a very clear metrics by which you're being judged. It's not some wishy-washy presentation or coursework. It's actual scores on an actual exam that you need to do that everyone in the country is taking. This is very important because if you think even under status quo, like I'm going to use A levels as an example, there are two major exam boards, AQA and edXL. But there's also many little exam boards. For example, this exam board called Salters Nuffield. Students taking Salters Nuffield who go to disadvantaged schools are going to struggle far more because there's far fewer resources online because far fewer students are taking them. Educators like who use YouTube are less likely to target you as demographics because they rely on like large audiences. So they pick the larger exam board. In this case, when you fracturize the syllabus up and you fracturize how things are being examined, it's much harder for students to access this. Okay, also I think you can't escape subjective teacher grading. It's always going to occur. Like when you do presentations, even when you're marking essays, like they say it's anonymized, but like when you know a student for a year, you notice their handwriting, and like the extent to which you can guarantee that schools anonymize this is like very unlikely considering the sheer breadth of like, just think how many assessments you do in school all year. Like I think this is unlikely, but like teachers have already shown to have like hugely subjective grading based on other characteristics, based on like bias. If you give students like even based on things like handwriting, based on like the personality of students, right? I think private schools are also more like pressured to give higher grades because of monetary incentives and pressure from parents. Okay, why are we going to give you a separate argument? Why are you going to get incentives for higher standards? Because I think that it's worse for schools who have to design these curriculums on their own. They are going to have less time, right, to teach. And so you just straight away throw away teachers' time to designing this curriculum. But also I think that schools who are less funded are going to design worse curriculums and design worse assessment strategies just because they have less money, right? Schools struggle to formulate these syllabuses, but also I think they're more likely to cut material because they already under status quo teach fewer lessons. They already under status quo teach like syllabus worse. They're more likely because of their funding constraints, because they have so many students, to just cut syllabuses and like make less of an effort to push through because they know that teachers and the school have control of the benchmarks by which students are examined. They can just decide to choose different averages to measure students by, and so it's much easier to like sort of bias this way, right? So I don't care whether the average is higher or lower if the average is biased, right? Because it means that students they're not necessarily being getting the actual material education they require. Like think about the fact that teachers have to work 2 jobs. They're more willing to, they're more happy if they don't have like a national exam that holds them to account to just cut parts of the syllabus. This means also it's much harder to hold schools to account because it's shows less like clear standing of which schools underperform, which schools need resources, which schools don't, because schools are now incentivized to give higher grades while teaching less of a syllabus. And this means that it's much harder to focus on where you need to put your resources and pinpoint where you need to improve because you have all these messy metrics rather than a clear metric. This has many impacts, right? Because firstly, you just get broadly worse education. You like life skills that are good for social mobility, even if you don't go like above and beyond. Furthermore, right, I think you get a broader knowledge, you're more likely to find your interest. But I think also you're more able to push students to learn more and get grades on par with like richer, more well-off students. We're able to deal with that, right? So now you don't have to rely on contextual offers. We're able to push them up. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that member for what was a very fine speech. I'd now like to welcome the member of opposition to carry on the debate. Here.
Okay, cool. So assuming then everybody can hear and see me, I prefer my POS audibly, so feel free to unmute during unprotected time. frame on weighing for 3 extensions. The frame is that this debate is most important in the countries that aren't about the Ivies and Oxbridge, right? I think this debate is most important when we're talking about developing countries, when we're talking about students who are going to university probably for the first time, right? When they're going to like their state schools, a government-run public school, not the highest tier of university, but rather just trying to get into any university at all. Why is this? One, I think we just have to care about these people more, like principally more important. Two, I think the margin of change is way wider, right? Like I think on either side of the house, when we're talking about higher level universities, we're probably going to get wealthier students funneled into them anyways, right? Maybe OO was able to prove some marginal level of change. I don't really know. Maybe Gov was. I don't really know. I think you can get a much more substantial level of change when we're talking about universities that are more accessible, when we can push students up. This is why you should care about them more. First argument then, analysis extension on why brighter students are going to be selected who are better prepared for the future. Why are standardized tests a bad way of measuring intelligence and success both for universities and jobs? Firstly, because of the test-taking bias. I think the average reasonable voter has taken an exam. They know that test-taking strategies and your preparation have a substantial effect on exams. Why is this? One, they're standardized. That means that they have to have similar forms each year that allow you to have to learn certain methods and ways of gaming the system, right? They're going to be the same patterns repeated, whereby if you have learned and like studied the exam enough, you can do well on it. Two, I think as CG says, they're going to be widely publicized. That means that people who have closely revised the test can have an advantage, as opposed to on our side, when you can't have an advantage review just because like these exams are designed by schools, they're probably not as publicly available. Why is that a good thing? Because I don't think we should be rewarding people just because they happen to arbitrarily have the time to study for an exam more, right? We may want to reward hard work in the status quo, but we need to understand that hard work is a function of how much time you have to work hard, right? What are your clashing obligations? All of that. So I think by putting these exams out and by making test-taking strategy such an important part of standardized exam success, you tend to select bad students in the process. Second mechanism is that you can just have a good or a bad day, right? Obviously, if you're sick or grieving like OG says, you can reassess the test on either side. Obviously, if you tell your teacher you have a major illness, you're allowed to skip a small few tests. But I'm not talking about such major disruptions, right? I'm talking about other things. If you happen to be in a bad headspace, if you just had a major argument, if you saw something traumatic the day before, even if your stomach is upset, right? This will have an inconsequential effect on our model, whereby this only affects like 0.5% of like your final like overall grade, right? But think about it. Just having one thing wrong with like how you're feeling on the day that you're taking a major exam, when it's not substantial enough, like your dad dying, to get an exam exemption, could screw over your entire exam future. It screw over like all prospects you have for university on government side. I think this matters a lot. It's not something that they can model out, and it really affects people. Third reason is that I think it's just bad preparation for the real world. This is direct rebuttal to opening government saying this is like the real world. Because one, I think in the real world, you do have consistent periods of moderate pressure, both professionally and academically, and thus this is better preparation for that. Most jobs that people work, like construction or basic desk jobs, blue-collar work, not the 0.1% of lawyers that opening government wanted to talk about, are consistent moderate pressure jobs, right? There aren't these sudden peaks of what really matters. Rather, you're just consistently working on the same basis. There's no significant changes in your pressure. So I think we better prepare individuals for that, and we better select individuals who are qualified for those jobs. But two, I think in terms of selecting people who are better in the real world, you choose students who know how to effectively use resources, right? Because at no point in your job is your boss going to be like, hey, no calculator, no resources, tell me what the square root of 27 is. Like, when the hell does that happen, right? I think more realistically, you ought to be rewarded on the basis of whether or not you can usefully access the resources around you to benefit your company, your role, right? I think in that regard, the vast majority of standardized exams, as OG concedes, tend to be like closed book. You don't have resources to work with it. Therefore, I think when you allow resources on our side, when you allow it to be like a more holistic process that a school is running, I think that better prepares you for the future when it's more realistic, where you do use resources and we pick those who most intelligently use resources. All these things really matter for the weighing the opening opposition gave, but also I think it's about like, if people are going to university, then we might as well get like the best students who are most deserving, right? At that point, I think we do it better. Before moving on, I'll take OG.
You say that standardized exams repeat and are standard. If your frame is about poorer students in poorer schools, isn't it easier for them to study this?
No. This is my second argument. No, this is my second argument. Yeah. Okay, cool. Second argument on how we get better poor students to university, right? Note CG just saying that contextual admissions exist is empirically untrue in most countries that aren't as woke about inequality as the UK. And two, fails to provide any structural reasons, regardless though our claims outweigh it. So why are standardized tests so much more unfair? Because as like OO said, it's easier to be tutored for a standardized test, right? But I think this isn't as important in the context that we gave, given that like tutors exist when you're trying to get into like Oxbridge or whatever on both sides. So our reasons are more important. What are our reasons? Firstly, I think wealthy schools are more incentivized to teach to the standardized exam, right? That is to say that there are more students within these schools that are planning on going to university. Think of the incentives of schools. They get funding and status through kids getting to uni. That means that as a poor school, either you don't teach the exam and you get comparative low success rates for the exam for your students, and therefore your students can't go to university, or you do teach the exam and fully leave behind the 90% of kids who probably aren't even planning on going to university, because that is the reality in most developing countries, in countries like most in South Asia and like developing Africa, right? But two, I think more students tend to do well on the exams in these countries, in these schools. They tend to come back and teach other students. Second mechanism is, though, that schools are going to deviate from the curriculum just based on how familiar their teachers are with the material. This clashes with CG's extension of you knowing the exam and OG's POI, because teachers on either side aren't perfect. These are young people who aren't being paid a ton and are probably annoyed with their jobs, right? That means that teachers have different levels of understanding and familiarity with the exam based on how much they themselves prepared based on how long they've been teaching. That means that the oldest and most experienced teachers tend to go to wealthier schools, and thus the others left behind don't really know the nuances of curriculum and the final exam. In our world, whatever your teacher teaches you, even if it isn't perfectly the curriculum, is going to be what you're assessed on, because the teacher is the one making the test. If a teacher happens to screw up on like our world and doesn't teach what the government wants you to do, there's no major consequences that a student unfairly has to experience just because their teacher wasn't great, like most teachers are, because they are being assessed on what they actually learned. I think this is a good thing because we tend to get more social mobility for those who most need it. We get better individual poor off students in our world. Thirdly and finally, we improve students who don't go to university. Weighing here, most kids don't go to university and don't even expect or intend to in most countries, right? The only education they may get in their lives, the only opportunity to improve their lives, is what they learn in school. How do we get that better? One, we give them an incentive to stay in school for longer. OG conceded to this in their argument. I think this is a good thing, because even if it harms you in the short run, I think more education is good for you in the long run, as it opens up more job prospects, right? So if they concede to that, here's why you also get taught more useful things on our side, even if you don't go to university. Because standardized tests tend to teach the most basic things that don't help you in real life, right? Because they need to cater to the least common denominator. Whereas if your teacher is the one crafting your curriculum and your exam, they can teach things that are locally useful. If you come from a factory hub, if you come from a farming hub, they can teach things that are more useful, more relevant to your actual life, rather than just abstract things that come on a standardized exam. For every action in this debate, vote CO.
I'd like to thank the member for what was a very fine speech. I'd now like to welcome the government whip to conclude side government's part in this debate. Hear, hear.
The most important impact in this round is not reducing the degree to which inequality affects students on tests or in school. The most important impact in this round is reducing that inequality in the first place, because it is upstream of whether tests are accurate. It is upstream of whether you have a job or have something that occurs to you that prevents you from being able to do well on the test. It is upstream of every single impact that any other team in this round has presented to you. What we tell you on closing government is a simple story. Governments need a map to improve the neediest schools. They need incentives to improve those schools. And you only get that push by switching to this model. And you need a frame of comparison to objectively compare the worst performing schools with the best performing ones. Because what happens on their side of the house when there is no nationally objective model in evaluating whether some schools are good and some schools are bad? There could be two schools that have the same exact curriculum, one that does super well and one that does super horribly. This is really important because there is no control over how curriculums are designed in their world, meaning that it's just as likely that the bad teachers that they talk to you about in developing countries design horrible curriculums because they don't have the resources, but their graduation rates look great. That is the simple comparative that we offer to you in this round, that without standardized tests, there are incentives to depreciate teaching quality without actually reducing outcomes on paper. Students are still graduating, but they don't actually have the skills necessary to succeed in the real world. And we tell you that this is the most important impact in the round, whether you look at the developing world or the developed world, because we say that this hits the disadvantaged schools the hardest, the poorest schools, the schools that are failing, state schools with the highest numbers of minorities. We tell you that if we give you an incentive and the funding power to improve, that is going to be the most important impact in the round. All right. Before I do anything, I want to do a couple of notes of rebuttal. Opening opposition makes 3 arguments, 2 responses to each of those in turn. The first argument that they make is essentially that open curriculums are better. Actually, we disagree completely because so many schools in the status quo are failing. Yes, they have curricular flexibility, yet their students are unprepared for college. This occurs because the incentive to do good on government spends simply disappears. The thing is, even if there are some poor schools that are using good tactics in the status quo, we literally have no frame of reference in their world because there aren't standardized tests that exist to compare between schools. Furthermore, we do not think that it is universally true that these schools are doing well, even though their graduation rates might look good. Their teachers are lazy. Oftentimes they have another job. Furthermore, curriculums that they develop on their own is just weaker than the curriculum that experts are able to create when you vote for them. I think that their characterization of standardized testing just being memorization is just simply not the case, right? I think that standardized tests are created by experts to create a nationally objective metric to measure creative or critical thinking across the board. But even if it's not, we think that you need a frame of comparison to create any positive change for the weakest schools. And so I don't really think it matters in the round. Second of all, on the issue of increasing the number of students going to university, we're actually just going to heavily marginalize this because we think that the likely way that this would be adopted would be in an incredibly contextual way. Even if countries do not have these systems in the status quo, we think that they're not going to be idiotic and just be like, oh, the students who get tutoring are going to be able to go into college. No, they're probably going to be like, if you're from this income bracket, this is the this is the test score that you need to make. This is not going to be implemented idiotically. Furthermore, we think that people can always retake their tests. I think we can just heavily mitigate this. Finally, on the idea that you just get less art and happy things in school. School does not disappear, guys. Teachers are still going to be using these methods because they are engaging to students. They're just going to be working off of fixed curriculums that standardized exams give them, which means that students are going to be more prepared for the real world. Then they tell you that consistent testing is less stressful. Look, I think this is kind of an unresolved clash on the top half, but I don't really think it matters that much in the round. I think a much more important issue is probably going to be who is better able to serve the most underserved students and who is best able to improve schools, because it's a much more systemic impact than the single student that's stressed or not stressed on test day. Also, we just think that to an extent, schooling is just an endemically stressful thing because people are trying to get into college and determine their futures. I don't think it gets much worse or much better when you have consistent stress versus stress concentrated in one period. Finally, they say that tests are not holistic, that they are tests of memorization. I think that this is rather assertive, right? I think that there are lots of tests that standardized tests lots of skills that standardized tests actually do test, but more importantly, this will probably be designed to include all of those other critical skills that they say is so important. I don't know, perhaps there's a qualitative aspect to the standardized test once this becomes normalized as the motion poses. So I don't think that this is a big harm in the real world. Let's talk about closing government, because I think that their impacts are actually not very good. Their first is that they ensure that brighter students go to college. Even if you buy all of their mechanisms as to why you get more brighter students in college, why is that important? Why is it important that you already get the students who are bright and capable of talent into college? The more important impact should be increasing the overall brightness of students by improving educational quality, and we can only do that on our side of the house. Their solution is just inherently unequal. Then they basically copy paste the opening argument about how there's lots of factors of inequality that can uniquely affect you on test day. I just think that this kind of largely gets solved when you're able to write a contextual piece in your college admissions thing, being oh, I had a mental health emergency when I was taking my test. Oh, my dad died before I took the test. I just don't think that this is going to be a huge impact. Finally, even if it is unequal, we still think that these are the outlier cases, right? The one student who has a bad who has a bad day on test day and can't go to the college that he wants, right? On the whole, these are outliers in the national trends that we are able to see via standardized testing. All right, so I want to re-explain our mechanism because I think that this is what wins us the round. Because what we tell you is that in the status quo, there is no way to see how schools are doing, right? One poor school could be doing horribly, but graduating all of its students, whereas another could be doing great and not graduating any of their students at all. What does standardized testing uniquely do? What standardized testing uniquely does is create a frame of comparison between those schools that are that are struggling and forces teachers to improve their curriculum to the test. Even if these curriculum get a little bit worse, it's important that there's a national comparative for this reason. The reason is because schools who have the lowest amount of standardized test scores enable the government to fund those schools and improve the quality of education in them. We solve back for the problems of like underfunded teachers, for example, or like teachers who don't care about school, or like mismanaged curriculums, simply because we just get much more government oversight over the test. You just generate masses of data that the government is able to act on. You give them the map and tools that they need in order to improve the most struggling schools. This looks like the most needy schools in America, or wherever that they want to talk about, having better curriculums and having better outcomes, because you actually teach students the skills that they are required to learn in college. But more importantly, because you can see where schools are failing. You can see the schools that are doing the worst on the most nationally objective metrics. As a result of this, in their world, you do not get that frame of comparison. And as a result, the poorest schools where skills are not taught are left to suffer and hang dry.
I'd like to thank that member for what was a very fine speech. I'd now like to welcome the opposition whip to conclude the novice final. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah, okay, cool. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. Two clashes in this speech. Firstly, on equality. Secondly, on which is more effective at measuring performance and getting kids who deserve to get into university in. First of all, on equality. And I want to flag right at the top here, panel, that we think this is the most important clash in this debate. We think this is about getting students into university who are going to make the most of those opportunities, who, as Drew pointed out, on whom this is going to have the largest marginal impact on their life, on their quality of life in the future, and on social mobility. We think this is incredibly important, and opening half recognized that. The only team that tries to dispute this clash's importance is closing government. How do they do that? They basically just give one line and say, well, let's contextualize grades. So getting minorities into university is pretty symmetric on both sides of the house. I don't think that's really enough to disprove the importance of this, but two responses. Firstly, I think contextualizing grades is considerably harder when you have a single standardized test. Why? Because you're much more likely to get backlash from wealthier students who feel like they've been cheated. It's a lot easier for a wealthier student to look at their grade and compare it to a poorer peer and say, well, they got a lower grade than me. How come they got into university? And complain. In contrast, if you're comparing lots of different bits of data, then it's a lot easier to say, well, maybe they beat you on this test, but you beat them on this test, so therefore we took them for those reasons. Secondly, when you have lots of data, we just think it's easier to contextualize students' performance. Why? Because you're able to see trends. You're able to see the impact that them being ill or them being bereaved had on their performance. Given that we've proved that this is the most important clash then in this debate, if we prove this clash, I think we win this debate on its own. Opening governments say that their side of the house is fairer for minorities for three reasons. And I want to flag here again that opening opposition don't engage with any of these mechanisms in their speech. So we're going to do that work for them, and in doing so, beat opening government and opening opposition in the process. Firstly, they tell us that poorer students have to do part-time jobs, and they can then give up those jobs for exams while doing it for the rest of the time at school. I already flagged in a POI, you're not able to just give up a part-time job for 3 months if you need that money to feed your siblings. They concede in response to my POI that in fact this probably isn't something that happens, but recognize the importance of that concession panel, because it's not just conceding that this mechanism doesn't stand, they concede that in fact for students with part-time jobs, their life is better under our side of the house, where they're able to work consistently for 5 years, when they're able to plan their work around their part-time job and not suddenly have to drop it for 3 months. Secondly, we're told that you need soft skills in order to get these sorts of grades in all year round testing. This looks like group projects, presentations, and these skills aren't taught in less wealthy schools. I think opening government are right here. These are important life skills that aren't taught in poorer schools, but I'm not sure why these skills can't be taught in poorer skills if that's what's required for university. And recognize, panel, the reason why these skills aren't being taught under the status quo is because there's only a finite amount of teachers and resources, and they're focused on how to do well in standardized tests because that's what's required for getting students into university. That's how the school's performance is going to be judged. That's how their individual performance is going to be judged as teachers. We think when we change this, when we actually make those skills valuable in getting students to succeed, then they're much more likely to focus on these things. So again, I think this mechanism is not only taken out for opening government, it is a substantive benefit for opposition because we show why schools are likely to teach these useful life skills. Thirdly, we're told that this is better for late bloomers who only learn things just before A levels. I think what opening government missed here is analysis of how universities are actually going to select students. When you're able to assess a wide range of data, you can look at the trends. If someone suddenly got a lot better in the last year, you're likely to consider them because you can see that they're on an upward trajectory. But secondly, we just don't think that cramming the night before an exam is a good way of learning, as opening government want to tell us. I think there's a reason why teachers advised against it. You only learn things in your short-term memory, which means if you actually need them for a job, if you actually need to learn things when you're in the workplace in the future, you're much less likely to be able to do that, and it's going to be considerably more stressful for you. Before I go on to talk about closing government, I'll take opening and POI.
Your member will wait for us that your school experience matters more as most don't go to university anyways. We uniquely prove that we make schools better by reducing pressure and worry over many termly exams and the mock exams preparing for those termly exams.
Yeah, I'm talking about that in my speech. I'm going to explain why we think these are much better methods of measuring performance and also why it's fairer for minorities. We think if the outcomes end up being fairer, that probably also reduces your stress while you're in school. Closing government tell us three things on fairer education. Firstly, they tell us that in standardized exams, it's clear what's going to be tested, and so you can get access to resources online. We think under our side, this is largely symmetric, right? If your exam is being set by your teacher and they're the one assessing it, you literally have direct access to the person setting the exam. We think it's relatively easy to ask them for advice there. Secondly, we're told that teachers can't be objective, and so they're going to like mark exams unfairly. Recognize the importance and the difference here under our side of the house when we have a lot of data to judge on. Because if one teacher is unfair, you can compare that to dozens of other tests across their time at school. In contrast, when you only have one standardized test to judge a child's performance on, it's impossible to see if they got that score by an unfair advantage. Finally, we're told that poorer schools are going to be worse at teaching and are going to cut parts of the syllabus because they can measure things through other means. Note what Drew told you here, and note we got no response to. Under our side, you're judged on what your teachers teach you. So we think we can flip closing government's impacts here, right? We think you're only going to be assessed on the things that actually were covered in lessons rather than things that maybe your teacher didn't get around to teaching. But secondly, we actually think the problem that they describe of poor schools having to cut content is exactly what happens under the status quo with standardized tests, because teachers know that certain content doesn't matter. They can't cut that content under our side of the house. So note what Drew told you, and note the comparison with what OO said there. OO said that you can get tutoring. Drew gave you three more mechanisms as to why we think we advantage minorities and poorer groups under our side of the house. And in addition to that, Drew explained why those who don't go to university are likely to be advantaged as well. I think therefore, if we weigh ourselves against opening opposition, we think their stuff on students being less stressed and doing better at uni, that's important. We think our impacts outweigh that, because it doesn't matter how well you do at uni if a massive group of children are locked out of those opportunities. If we prove that clash, we win this debate. Secondly, then on performance, Drew tells you here that you're much more likely to have an accurate measure of performance when you take lots of long-term data into account. And the only response we get is that you can contextualize information here. Recognize Drew explicitly responded to this when said that often the reasons why you do badly in a test are not big enough to write in contextual data, but are smaller things, are more subtle things that impact your ability to do well. Opening government say that it's going to be more similar to real life. I think Drew comprehensively responded to that, and we got no response. And then they tell us that it's easier to cheat on long-term assessments. We think, in fact, the opposite is true, because it's not just about having invigilators in the room, it's about comparing student performance. If a student suddenly does better on one exam, you can see quite clearly that they've been cheating there. However, if you only have one test to judge on, you've nothing to compare that to. You're not able to see if they're cheating. But then we take out both parts of the opening government case, we engage with them, which opening opposition doesn't, and we outweigh opening opposition on our metrics. We also take out the closing government extension. So both on equality and performance, we win this debate.
It's been a really interesting debate, and congratulations for all of our novice finalists. Marina, with the novice finals announcements, are those going to be taking place alongside the rest of the finals announcements?